Well, as you can clearly see, this is gonna be a long one. Why is this so long? Consider this my first proper dive into game analysis. That one was different! And also, Dread has ignited a passion in me I haven't had the pleasure to have in a long ass time. The huge surge of people coming in also indicates to me that giving 1 minute to review a game that has been touched mainly on the surface level is not something I want to do. Welcome, by the way, new viewers. I hope you enjoy your stay. Now prepare your asses because you're about to get bombed by an avalanche of opinions. So today, we'll cover every major aspect of Metroid Dread. Everything from gameplay to atmosphere to structure and everything in between. Today, I'll lay every feeling I have about Metroid Dread on the table. What are my likes and dislikes, and explore some possibilities the game should maybe have taken. This is for the most part the most detailed video I've ever made. So, let's begin. If you'd like to hear the TLDR of this video, it's pretty simple actually. Metroid Dread is a 9 out of 10 game that annoys the f*** out of me. Dread will please nearly all adventure types of gamers and deserves a recommendation from most people, including myself. The game is brought down by a couple of annoying elements that make it very frustrating to analyze under a microscope, which is why I said it annoys the f*** out of me. That's as simple as I can put it. Now, for the overly long version. Let's start this review/analysis with a quick summary of Dread's plot. Dread's story begins decades prior to its start. Two opposite tribes were living on a distant planet from one another, the Tohas and the Makin. Makins were a community of warriors and soldiers, whilst the Toha were researchers and people of peace. The latter went on to discover many worlds, until they landed on SR 388. There on the surface, the Tohas encountered possibly the most dangerous animal they ever laid their eyes upon. The Toha asked for assistance from the Makin, who soon moved in to fight off the X-parasites. After failing several times, the Tohas took the incentive to create a predator worthy of the X, the Metroids. During these operations, the Makin moved into the Toha's colony of Zebes. There, the leader of the Makins noticed a small girl moving in with them. Samus was her name. To ensure survival on Zebes, she received a transfer of Chozo DNA from both tribes. Ravenbeak wanted part of it and transferred part of his DNA to her, whilst her surrogate father did the same too. Years later, SR-388 began to devolve as the Metroids grew, surrounded by Aeon energy. They revolted against any living thing, including their own creators. After resisting as long as they could, the Toha faction prepared a plan to exterminate their creation from existence. Ravenbeak, after surveying the progress and power of the Metroids, revolted and executed the Toha members so it could become the greatest power in the galaxy, keeping only one alive to replicate the Metroids and control them as needed. Upon returning home from its genocide, Ravenbeak found no peace, as one of its soldiers was assimilated by the X, and in turn began to destroy the Makins on ZDR, killing nearly all of them. In a last-ditch attempt to contain the X, he sent all of his warriors to Elon, a facility constructed for the sole purpose of containing this parasite. It worked, leaving only 2 Chozos alive. After dealing with the issue, Ravenbeak went back to his original plan of capturing and breathing a Metroid. Fortunately for all, the Metroids were gone, extinct from creation. All except for a lone bounty hunter, his own daughter Samus Aran. So, he lured Samus with proof of the X still lingering threat. This attracted the Federation for sure, but not how he wanted. Instead, enemies were sent in to extract the X safely. Ravenbeak was enraged by this development and quickly dismembered the E.M.M.Is, only to realize this could turn to his advantage. Alongside Quirobe, he reprogrammed the E.M.M.Is to hunt and extract Metroids. And, just as planned, the Federation sent in the lapdog to finish the job. Upon Samus' arrival on ZDR, she descended to Altaria where Ravenbeak was waiting. He forced Samus to activate a latent Metroid potential and stripped her of her abilities. His plan was working superbly until Quirobe chimed in. He revealed Ravenbeak's whole plan and stopped the enemies from pursuing Samus. Ravenbeak, in response, sent in his robotic servants to do the work he should have done long ago, killing the last member of the Toha tribe. Samus simply continued on her journey on this whole debacle. Unfortunately, during these events, Samus mistakenly unleashed the X onto ZDR, throwing the whole balance of the ecosystem out of order. After the X rampage, Samus tries to still flee the planet while still facing some X at the same time, ridding the parasite of the planet. This led Samus to discover that Ravenbeak was creating life forms, duplicating them, in order to create armies faster than anything she's ever fought before. In response, Samus needed more power, and in turn, developed into a fully grown Metroid, ready to face Ravenbeak with her own powers. He was ultimately defeated as Samus transformed into the greatest weapon of the galaxy. With her new powers, she drained Entourage and Ravenbeaks of any power they had, crashing the fortress into the planet ZDR, forcing it to explode. After a quick escape, Samus gained back the ability to control her Metroid genes and was able to escape the burning fires of ZDR. Ending the story of Metroid Dread. Okay, so while this is really only a small recap of those events, I'm glad Dread touches on themes not found in previous entries, that of parenting and nurture, and while they aren't really that present, presenting some is better than none. I mean, it's one of the founding problems I had with Super Metroids. You could attach a story, but themes weren't really present. We got more out of Samus here than in most games. Most of it is communicated through her animations, which feel more personal than they were in Prime Trilogy, which is great! We get to see Samus's reaction to story beats and the enemies she's faced off with more than just facial expressions. She speaks exactly 2 lines in the script and does 4 in cutscene screams. That's the extent of her spoken action dialogues. However, she is an active participant of story beats, which is more than I could ask for in the Metroid title. She actively changes how the story plays out, and it's a great way to further the plot without making it feel like a video game quest along the lines of Metroid Prime 2, for example. There's no such thing as a MacGuffin in this game. That's what I mean. Being proactive in a plot makes for a stronger impression of a character in the minds of the players. That's the reason why the Doomslayer is stuck in people's mind. It's because he's progressing and actively changing story segments without needing to react to his environments. Just go look up on YouTube Samus Badass, and you'll see dozens of compilation of her actions in Dread dictating how the story progresses instead of just reacting to it. Dread defines Samus Aran as a badass mother. I love this about Dread. In terms of character, Samus is perfected in her presence here and rides a fine line between being too proactive and passively reacting to the plot. That's really rare. Even more so for a Metroid game, which last time this happened was during Metroid 2 back in 1991. Woo! That was the last time Samus had agency during an active plot in the game. Although you can make an argument for Metroid Fusion, just putting this out there. She never really had agency in those games, and we finally get to see something that's more interesting. I don't want to discredit the rest of the legwork done to make these story reveals effective outside of Samus's influence though. But this character takes the spotlight in this context. While I've complimented Ravenbeak as a character design in the past and his backstory is cool, I don't believe his motivation is that memorable. For Metroid standards, he's quite fantastic. His relation and exploitation of Samus reminds me a lot of Ridley in Supplementary Material, and that alone will be remembered quite fondly in the Metroid community for a very long time. Unfortunately, he's shallow. Like, really shallow. And while I don't mind it that much, it is legitimate criticism if someone expected or wanting something more out of it. I don't really want to talk about Quiet Robe and Adam since they barely have an effect to the story. However, the setup for the Adam reveal is exceptionally well done for something so simple and adds layers of manipulation to Ravenbeak's scheme. My biggest issue with Dread's story really is in its structure. The search action genre, yes I call it the search action genre and will keep doing so for the rest of this review, is not very well suited to standard narrative format, which is why most games hide quote-unquote the lore and plot in optional scans or logs, that sort of thing. Breaking the pace of the play with constant story beats is not what most players want in these kinds of games. Really, what you get in Dread is a trade-off. You have a better understanding of the plot by having forceful cutscenes, but lose the sense of discovery and history you'd get otherwise. It's not to say Dread doesn't do legwork in their environmental design to communicate a sense of history like this footage depicts, but it's not as apparent as, say, the Prime games. My main issue comes at one point, and one point really. It's this cutscene, and only this one. This singular cutscene is 7 minutes of exposition, and while it's great for the lore nerds, it's disappointing for the rest of us. Spreading these out or flat out omitting this kind of exposition would have been better. Outside of that, this cutscene also means that Quiet Robe is a plot convenience for the rest of the story. It's convenient he was the only one of the Tohas alive. It's convenient that he was able to spill Ravenbeak's entire plan and help Samus before being killed by his servants. It's convenient that he was copied by the X, thus being able to give Samus the Toha genes back. It's convenient that he was at Samus's ship before she lifted off the planet. It's convenient that he regained part of his morals to grant Samus control over new powers, maybe?
That doesn't make sense.
This singular cutscene, for the most part, renders Quiet Robe as irrelevant of a character and makes him a tool to serve the plot instead of him functioning the plot. Metroid isn't known for story, although the lore is pretty good, to be honest. I can't say I'm disappointed about the overall plot, since the pacing was terrific. It's hard to imagine someone playing Dread for the first time and not losing their when Samus becomes a fully grown Metroid. There's always something happening in Dread. Things happen in succession so fast, and while that's mostly due to the game's overall pacing, the actual plot always has something going on. That's definitely something I can easily praise Dread, especially if you feel like having something to do in short-term goals keeps you motivated as a player outside of gameplay motivators. If you prefer having more breathing room between story beats, then Dread does also a better job at it too, considering it's most likely the longest 2D Metroid game, clocking in about 6 to 10 hours, I want to say, on your first playthrough. There are definitive problems with the story due to its, let's call it, uncomplicated nature, especially since I believe other search action games have done a much better job at defining simpler stories. Look at the Ori games, for example. If anything, I'd say it's a bit behind compared to its competition, but not that far. It is relying on conventional narrative format that has been improved on for several years. For my money, Dread is a good Metroid story and a mediocre search action game story. It's not a story that will resonate to new players because there's too much going on. Even if the game tries its best at doing a recap at the beginning, you can still understand it quite easily, it just won't resonate with new players that much, or at least I don't think so. Take that as you wish. I think it's pretty much universally agreed upon that the music compositions in Dread are lacking. Not bad, just lacking. And I completely agree with this statement. Now, for the record, I am not a musical artist, nor do I know any level of music theory. Although I base my opinions on following statements in previous experiences in comparison with prior games in the franchise. If you ask some Metroid fans which games have their favorite OSTs, I believe most would agree that Prime 1 and Super have the best track compositions. Now, I'm not putting down Fusion or Prime 2 or Prime 3 for that matter, or any other game for having bad OSTs. Just implementing the idea that most fans enjoy Prime 1 and Super from a musical perspective more. And as soon as you put Dread next to these games, then it becomes extremely apparent why Dreads fall short. Dread's composition are faded, unnoticeable, quiet. They don't pop, and that's very much the idea behind their execution. Your focus in the game is meant to be a sense of dread.
That's kind of funny.
And while I don't believe it's solid enough to accomplish this, the idea of unknown danger lurking behind the next corner was the basic idea behind it. The problem is quite simple. It's not foreboding enough to do the job it's meant to do. Those tracks are supposed to make you fear the unknown as you literally fight for your survival. The basic concept of it is much scarier than Metroid Fusion or any other game for that matter. You are stranded with nothing on you and already know there are beings on this planet who are willing to kill you if need be. So why, as players, are we completely comfortable moving on? The compositions don't enhance those feelings. The first track of Ataya should be disorienting, foreboding, bloody scary as hell. Instead, I feel like, what? What am I hearing? There's a sole exception to this missing feeling of dread, and that's the E.M.M.I zones. So, yeah, let's take a quick tangent to talk about the tracks that do, in fact, work. The tracks are implemented and work to enhance what's happening in the game. From my personal perspective, the E.M.M.I track, Ravensbeak's final fight, the main menu theme are amongst the only ones that truly, quote-unquote, work. The E.M.M.I tracks are my favorite, and not because I enjoy listening to it, far from it. Listening to them makes me feel like a rabbit being hunted. My heart rate bumps up to measly 160 BPM every time it plays. I say it's my favorite because it's the most effective track out of all of them. Everything about it is easily understandable and makes me my pants. Secondly, the OST of Ravenbeak plays into a simple trope of final boss music, but it's still very competent in what it's doing. Look at any apologist of Dread's music and you'll see them playing this track because it does its job again very effectively, and it's kinda hype. My last pick is a cop-out answer considering it's a mix of different tracks from previous titles, but as far as selling you the name of the game, Dread, it's effective. Metroid games rarely fault main menu music, so I'm glad we still get a banger track to open Dread. So, how many is that total? Like, 6 tracks out of 50 plus? Yeah, that's not a good ratio. Again, I hate to do it. That's a lie, I love to do this. I look at something like Prime's OST, and out of 40 tracks, maybe 5 or 6 of them I actually dislike, or feel indifferent towards. It's a complete 180, so my mind is boggled at what happened here. From a quick Google search, legendary composer Kenji Yamamoto was credited as music director. Whilst I don't know what this title means, I assume he was in charge of supervising the music department. The actual music composer for Dreads are Soshi Abe and Sayaki Doi. You'll have to excuse my pronunciation of their names. So I can't really tell you full context of what I was expecting to hear since I don't know any of their previous work. Maybe they were aiming for a Breath of the Wild transparent sound. Maybe they wanted something more afterthought surrounding ZDR's Cavern. Maybe they wanted to give Dread the identity of quiet music. Something along the lines of more ambient focused search action games maybe. I definitely heard similar complaints and arguments both for and against those types of soundtracks, so I don't think the comparison is that dissimilar. With that said, if the point of making any quote-unquote invisible music was the point, I think games like, again, Breath of the Wild still did it better. The fact that I find it exceptionally hard to find the point and or themes of the track is not doing Dread's OST any favors. But I have to call an ace with an ace. Is that a saying? I'll make it one. I hate to say it because, well, it's true, but if a game makes me want to turn off the volume of my TV, you failed at making your soundtrack part of the experience in my book. Even worse, if music from prior games fit your areas and situations better than the custom ones you've made, I'd argue you up hard, son. You could legitimately just replace guitarist's entire OSTs with something from Point 1 from the Magmore Caverns, and it would fit just as well. Try to find anyone on this earth who plays Sonic Adventure 2 with music off. I dare you! That is capital sin number 2! Genuinely, just look at CD Escape. Does that sound okay to you? Okay, so while the big elephant in the room has been covered, let's take the time to talk about the rest of the audio material in Dread and its overall execution. Let me start with a pet peeve of mine. The item acquisition is boring. It's not bad, but it doesn't tickle my scrotum the way it's supposed to. Bad analogy, worst orgasm. It sounds like a flat piece of music devoid of actual relief or victory or a feeling of power. Even in the previous games, when fear was very much a part of the experience, getting an item felt more celebratory than here. Even worse is the missiles and energy part jingle, because there is no jingle! I mean, obviously there's this sound playing. That's weak. Okay, this was really my only large piece of negative criticism for the sound design of Dread, since the majority of it is excellent. Not utterly fantastic, however, very competent. Themes, morph ball, missiles, critters, bombs, environment, they all have distinct noises that separates them. And whilst I can definitely say you could take some previous work from Prime and just drop it in Dread without anyone noticing, the clarity is solid. You wouldn't think these sounds would mix and mismatch most of the time. I particularly enjoy most bosses' sound effects. Askew is some of my favorite new additions. Solid screeches from Creature Audio too. A usual issue that I often encounter as well is mostly avoided here, and I very much appreciate it. Nothing sounds like a dinosaur would. Or at least how I think a dinosaur would sound as far as my experience with media is concerned. Sole exception for me would be the experiment fight. This isn't a huge issue in the grand scheme of things, but having unique sounds is what lends you a huge sense of credibility to the world you're playing in. Thinking back of when you were playing Prime 1 and entered Chozo Ghost Room and instantly knew their presence with their chirping. Or even Fusion and heard Nightmare in the distance of Area 5. That stuff is effective because both visuals and audio work do significant legwork to notify you of the danger. And I can confidently say that Dread has another one of those memorable audio moments as well. Those would be the E.M.M.I segments. What an effective method of scaring the player. Gameplay mechanics aside, if you were to judge the E.M.M.Is purely on the audio work alone, I'd easily put them at the highest quality concept of the entire game. Legit, it works just as well as the SAX Footstep and Fusion, and since they have more audio complexity to the new additions of new technologies, it just adds more layers to the actual E.M.M.I segments. Small nitpick, I do miss the X-Parasite sound effects from Fusion. Now it's just gloop. It does fit the slime appearance better than the old sound effects, but I'm too attached to them to actively care. Either that or the old sound effects are hidden extremely well within the mix. There are disappointments to be sure in the audio department, and it's a shame one section of one of the most iconic audio parts of Metroid is completely flat. But we've still gotten tons of solid audio work all around. It just further establishes that Dread was polished to a fine T. Metroid Dread is very modern in its visual approach. There's plenty of sleek characters, creatures, environmental designs. There's a distinct lack of jagged edges and spikes here. Even the monster characters have a distinct lack of pustules and hard features. That's not to say a bad thing.
One ugly motherfucker.
But it is noticeable if you approach the game with a zoomed-in lens. This unfortunately affects the atmosphere and darkness the game is supposed to give you. Music is affected by this too, as you read these events slightly differently as well. I've already talked about most character designs in Dread, so I won't touch on it too much here. All I want to say is I'm glad we're having a focus on character-based narrative, even if some missed the mark. Creature design is also at a high peak here, and is going to dictate whether you enjoy this new direction for Metroid visually. Gone are the ugly creatures, and welcome our more contemporary interpretation of the Metroid galaxy. I personally don't mind this new direction, but this does make me wish for some earlier possible throwbacks. Dread doesn't shy away from some more, let's call it gruesome elements of its design, but these uglier elements are missing. Something like Dragon will probably never happen again. And you know what? That was a relic of its time, and it's okay. With that said, we still get some pretty nasty stuff like Corpus, which challenges the art style like nothing else. If we keep getting stuff like that in the future in some small part, I'll be very happy. Just don't make Metroid some waifu bait, please? Sure, comparing sprite-based monsters to actual 3D renders is not, you know, comparable that much, but giving way to more rounded features on creature design now means that you lose a little bit of that hard edge and classic just gruesome horror that Metroid had back in the 90s. So while I am slightly disappointed in it, I won't lose any sleep over that. So when I see stuff like the infected Chosen soldiers with their gruesome mouth-splitting neck thing, I'm really happy. If we have to talk about visual fidelity, Metroid Dread is utterly fantastic, and whilst I am not well versed in visual specifics for video games, it's hard for me to talk on technical terms. From what I can say, frame drops are infrequent. That's about the extent of the technical mumbo jumbo I can talk about. On the artistic side of things, however, there are plenty of occasions where the game shows off its environments, rightfully so too. Areas like Farinia, Burinia, Kataris, they all make a solid effort to impress the players with its visual and environmental storytelling. That accounts for the history of the world and its narrative. That's a commendable thing for a series that's been, and let me be frank here, decades behind. Outside of straight up phenomenal backgrounds, the animations on display are top tier. The smoothness of gameplay transfers partially thanks to the animation's work. Nothing is sharp and follows a clear acceleration and deceleration. Even the simple way Samus goes from a static pose to a shooting position. It's detailed beyond belief with both large and small contribution. And my god, those cutscenes! They are so sick and communicate effectively the strength of character of Samus and the personality of the supporting cast. Even smaller elements of the visuals and particle are polished to a T, which, to be honest, I do expect from a big release from a Nintendo game nowadays. Even then, some of the stuff is pretty sick. Like, did you know that ice missiles creates white smoke once it makes collision? Probably yes. I mean, these missiles are cold, so it's better to communicate that visually with that color. But did you know, if you take a skinny dip in lava and shoot an ice missile there, the missile will explode with a reddish tint because it was heated? Probably not! Dread is filled with little quirks like these, and again create a more cohesive world by doing so. As smaller portions of the visuals, big fan of the classic approach to beams and particles. They're solid, straight, and clean. I like how the Aeon statues represent the abilities they grant just like in the Rory games. That's a very sweet touch. Raven's beak flowing pieces of cloth resembling war banners is such a sick design decision. It also better ties in with Quiet Robe, who also has streamers of cloth attached to his head ornament. There's an unbelievable amount of moving parts in the visuals present in Dread, and they deserve praise and attention for the sheer consistency of quality here. Generally, just go up online and go find Metroid Dread details. Metroid Dread, even without having to play the game or know anything about Metroid, promises one singular thing.
Oh, what a heavenly sound. Hold on, I gotta take it in.
Dread! The whole point to be placed in the scenario we are in during the events of the game is to give us an occasion to feel and relate to the trials Samus has to endure in the game. This leads me to this article right here. I mentioned before that Samus acts in Dread like nothing phases her. She's basically the Doomslayer with, thankfully, a little bit less gore. So when I stumbled across this article, I felt like this wasn't convincing enough. Here's the excerpt. Why go back to having Samus as a mostly silent protagonist? She doesn't have her Metroid Fusion elevator thoughts or Other M's monologues anymore. In this game, Samus barely speaks. The reason that I wanted to make it that way is the main theme of this game, which is Dread. I felt that to convey the current situation of Samus, or what Samus is thinking right now, this would better be conveyed to the player not through actual words or actual voice, but more with acting and visuals. I want the player to think, what is going on? What is Samus feeling right now? That is why I decided to go this way for the game. This answer is troubling. Simply because there isn't a scenario in the game where you can reasonably believe Samus is feeling this dread. Again, Samus doesn't give a shit about anything in Dread. She's a woman of efficiency, damn it! The in-game animation just aren't conveying this kind of emotions. And in the cutscenes, Samus is by far the least scared woman I have ever seen. She's for the most part in full control of the situation, so when I see something like this, I don't buy this quote at all. The one exception to this rule is the E.M.M.Is. It's the only time I felt something even remotely close to the feeling of dread. It's the only time where our animations changes to represent something close to fear. However, these instances aren't enough to convey the full game as dangerous. If Samus isn't fearful of this, why should I? Atmosphere isn't something definitive. We can't say as a statement if it succeeded or failed. We can only share whether it affected us or not. For my part, it did not. Metroid games, even with the mentality of ascension like Prime for me, still approaches scenarios with darker tones and contrasts those with lighter environments. I'd argue Dread didn't go enough with its visuals and audio work to instill a large amount of dread within me. Again, I'll praise the E.M.M.I zones for, at the bare minimum, trying to change the environments and contrasting it with the rest of the map. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but trying with a substantial amount of effort is praisable. Even Elon tried and did pretty well for Atmosphere. But both of these sections combined is maybe 25 to 30% of the game. The music is also partially to blame for this specific section. Look at any Metroid review, or even better, look at any Metroid review from a new fan's perspective. I'm nearly 100% sure you'll find some mention of Atmosphere in those earlier game reviews. Now, look at any Metroid Dread reviews, and try to find how often Atmosphere is mentioned as a specifics. Not the E.M.M.Is themselves, mentioning the Atmosphere specifically. I'm pretty sure the ratio of people that talk about it will be lower in comparison. And that's disappointing, because that's a huge part of what Metroid was, is, and will always be. I personally love what they tried to do with Elon and with the E.M.M.Is. I'm one of many, but there are many others who dislike those specific segments. But no one is gonna deny that those regions, those sections, those segments did their best at trying something different. And they only account for a very small portion of it. That's why I'm disappointed about the atmosphere in Metroid Dread. I wanted to have one segment dedicated for bosses, since there are a surprising amount to talk about here. So I'll start by saying this. Metroid Dread has by far the best 2D Metroid bosses. It truly comes pretty close to what you experience in the Prime games. Besides, there were barely any remarkable bosses in 2D games anyway. High quality bosses were pretty rare as it was. I'd include Nightmare, Ridley in Samus Return, the Diggernaut, and I think that's it. Other bosses to me in the 2D games range from it's just a spectacle to missile dump. And missile dumps are the exception in Dread. And even then, you still have ample space to approach fights with different tactics. Quick killing, face skips, multi-room shine sparks, looping back with higher grade weapons. It's utterly fantastic. I mean, even implementing a secret cutscene for grade quick killing just goes to show the amount of variety integrated for each boss. Even the lesser ones. The worst bosses of Dread are on par with some of the highest grade bosses from the other 2D games. Like, did you know you could bait the robot Chozo Warrior from going to the upper platform then going down, shines his shine spark and ram it in his stupid face? It's hard and you barely have the space to do it, but it's an awesome implementation of your whole arsenal. Did you also know that if you sequence break and come back to this room and use a power bomb, you can kill the dual robot Chozos in one bomb? Again, this applies to nearly every boss. The only exception I can think of is Scorpius, since he's literally the first boss, so your arsenal isn't complete to do crazy stuff, and E.M.M.I's, but we'll circle back to that one. Dread also contains my absolute favorite boss of any Metroid games, including the 3D ones, by the way. Ravenbeak is flat out f***ing amazing. This fight becomes a dance of epic proportion, and each additional phase brings out more and more and more until it collapses into an absolute spectacle without sacrificing its mechanics. That's how you do spectacle bosses! Let the player feel awesome for overcoming insane patterns and beating the odds! Don't let me wait out an opportunity to attack the boss, and don't make it a mindless shooting gallery. Oh. Now this is a little bit misleading on my part, since it's the only time Dread asks you to put very little effort in defeating a boss. I said we'll circle back to this one later. It took me well over 10 tries to beat Ravenbeak, and every attempt felt both impossible and steady in its progress. I really can't stress how unbelievably well paced this fight is, and replaying it only makes me appreciate the careful timing of every attack even more. That's the thing about Dread's bosses, they're extremely well telegraphed. This sounds quite stupid in a vacuum, since if you've ever played a AAA video game, all bosses telegraph their patterns. Let me explain. What sets Dreads apart is the clarity of it. That's what makes the difference. Here's an example, yeah? Here's Dead Cells, a game that relies on fast-paced action and quick reaction timing. Nearly all bosses have small move pools, but the anticipation frames are snappy. So, judging the actual windows of attack hit bosses is quite hard, and since bosses ramps up their speed as their HP depletes, it becomes even harder to judge correctly the timing of attacks. Dead Cells is quite a bit harder than Dread. But my point is, judging correctly is mostly inaccurate unless you dump a very large amount of time into the game. I myself have well over 100 hours into that game specifically, and I can't judge with accuracy when an attack will be launched. In contrast, I have lesser than 50 hours in Dread and can, with better accuracy, judge attacks' active windows through better anticipation phases of the animation. Yes, Dead Cells is faster, but Dread is clearer. No attack in Dread is cheap or feels cheap, since it's so clear and it lets you a huge sense of details that you wouldn't get from many search action games. The only boss who legitimately feels a bit unclear sometimes is the robot Chozo Warriors. That's the worst offender of Dread, and he's nowhere near problematic. Maybe a bit boring as a boss, but certainly not terrible. Honestly, the honor of the worst designed fight for me goes to the infected Chozo soldiers. You start fighting them midway through the game and are reused in, I believe, 5 times total. And with only two variations. one in the form of a shield and the other one in form of a beam attack. I say they are the worst designed boss since they are the one with the least amount of variety in which you can fight them. The only time you can vary encounters with them is by breaking the shield with either missiles, countering the shield bash, or grappling the shield after a parry. And the damage output is crazy high for some of these attacks. Like, damn! In all honesty, if Jorgaiga was repeated and I wouldn't skip it every run, I'd probably think worse of him than I do now. If I were to criticize negatively the bosses of Dread, I'd have to mention its repetition and high number tuning. Especially for hard mode, like, holy shit! Why does this attack do more damage than even the final boss of the game? I don't think many people were excited to find out a reused boss with a very limited moveset was reused as a double encounter. Twice! Dread has a good chunk of bosses as it is, and some of them you just stumble across like, huh, okay, guess we're fighting now. No mystery, no stress, no anticipation, just, alright, let's fight. Let's be honest, this infected Chozo didn't have to be placed here in the game. It's padding at worst and mildly uninteresting at best. Okay, now let's talk about the elephant in the room. E.M.M.Is. I won't touch on the actual segments here since I'll be talking about it in the gameplay section. What I will touch on right now is the moment you enter a central unit segment and the platforming chase following it. As far as my preference goes, I love the variety the E.M.M.I segments provides, which is interesting since, you know, they're repeated 5 times, but unlike the other infected Chozo soldiers, they have more going on with their abilities and environments. I truly believe the E.M.M.I's fights are a test of solid platforming rather than pure combat skills, which, in a platforming shooter, I appreciated the touch on the fundamental aspects of the series. The last time we had something along those lines was the Digger chase in Samus Return, and that was awesome! I love that your knowledge of platforming dictates your openings of damage for the E.M.M.Is. Unfortunately, aiming is still a big portion of the fight, but I'll be lying if I said that as an actual combat encounter, it's rich. It's not. The actual mechanics are shallow. To me, the actual fun part of facing the E.M.M.Is is clearing the most efficient path for the fight and see how close you can tickle the tiger before you decide to smack back. I understand the disappointment some players have with the E.M.M.I encounters and how closing of the fight is anticlimactic and how they're not challenging, even though I disagree with that. My point remains that the E.M.M.Is are a platforming boss through and through, and demands reasonable platforming skills to position yourself in a space where gunning them down is as safe as possible, through wonky and I'd personally say fun terrain challenges. Other arena for bosses are flat, and platforms are the exceptions, which is something I hope future search engine games can develop into something both fun and interesting. With that said, the central units, while a cute nod to both the lore and connection to the Chozos, are just missile dumps and sits at the bottom of the tier list. You know what, just for giggles, let's do a quick tier list. At the bottom of the list we have the destroyed E.M.M.I and the central units. Saying their boss fight is a really loose term since they provide very little challenge, but I have to include them at the bottom. Following them are the Chozo soldiers. It's a decent fight that gets tiresome very quickly with pretty much no variation. Up a tier and we have both the white and yellow E.M.M.I. They're decent but provides the exact same challenge, although quick killing them is quite fun. Following them we have Jorgaiga, a barely involved fight but gets a pass since it requires good aiming alongside quick switching of the grapple to avoid damage, which is the only boss who does it to my knowledge. That alone places it on a high level for me. Robot Chozo Warriors are next, and while I don't enjoy the patterns, the variety and possible tactics is legitimately fun. B tier is for actual good bosses. Yellow E.M.M.I is unpredictably fast, and finding the right spot to gun it down is thrilling, since if your aim is poor, it becomes extremely terrifying very quickly. Teal and purple are on the same category for me since they also provide a similar level of your pants if your aim is poor, with some legit good platforming and aiming problems. Golzuna is where it gets a little bit more fun. It's a very simple boss for what it's worth, but I'm glad it fakes you out on 2 separate occasions before the boss actually spawns. And I'm always a sucker for shine sparking bosses. Takes the cake for satisfying the player with precise inputs and timing. Me, that recoil is good. A tier demarks itself for having more precise and tighter combat. At the bottom we have SQ, who has a very small move pool but a satisfying fight which you can approach with plenty of tactics as long as you know your damage windows. Scorpius is here too, if only because as a first boss, it does a very solid job to teach you the importance of aiming and prioritizing different targets depending on your needs and wants. Aim for the tail for resources, head for meaningful damage. Following it up, we got Big Boy Kraid. A solid roadblock, unprepared players are gonna have a large amount of time to fight if you miss your platforming. In fact, I'd say Kraid is the most important boss to understand platforming since it allows you more damage windows and a safer target for the most part. Top of the A tier goes to Experiment Z57. Tons of spacing challenges, DPS checks, space jumping is super important, and awesome quick kill for phase 2. I love this boss. The top spot has to go to the man itself. Ravenbeak is amazing from head to toe. Widest move pool by far and lots of uses of mobility to vanquish him. Each phases have different qualities and challenges to them, which is how you do bosses with phases. The spectacle here is just as well done as any large creature encounters. It's just an on-point fight. Whilst it does feel impossible at first, understanding him makes him rewarding to progress even if just a little bit each time. Pattern recognition is one of the highest quality you must have to conquer him. Alright, let's talk about the most controversial part of the entirety of Metroid Dread. Let me start with, I like the E.M.M.Is. I really do, and my reasoning for them is mostly due to gameplay purposes than narrative or lore reasons. Even visuals, I'd say, but let's cover those one at a time. A lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, have made the comparisons of the SAX with the E.M.M.Is. And to be fair, I did as well. But stepping back a little, I now see the nearly completely different purposes they fulfill. This is my interpretation of the SAX Infusion as not a hunter/chase mechanic, but a narrative tool. Saying the SAX add a lot of gameplay purposes is a flat-out lie. SAX was barely an active player in that game. The reason it was effective is because it played with the idea of untouchable terror. By limiting its gameplay interactions, you could make the SAX serve greater narrative motivations for the player. I'll repeat myself once again. As a gameplay mechanic, it was bare bones. But as a narrative tool, they shine above most Metroid's villain. The E.M.M.Is fulfill something close to the SAX, only in reverse. They have very little impact on the narrative. They had to essentially force them onto the plot and write around it to even include them into the game. There are minor villains that could easily be replaced with, say, the robot kills the soldiers of Ravenbeak and would require almost no major rewrites. They fill a spot as a gameplay tool. They were created and designed around their gameplay and not the other way around. This has some major benefits in terms of design, since the challenges you want to task the player with are now the centerpiece of creating your perfect monster. That's the reason why their hands is small and their bodies lanky, so they can crawl into more ball-sized tunnels and under a variety of things. Now that we understand what the E.M.M.Is are fulfilling, we can now talk about how they did it. The segments are, in my mind, platforming challenges. They're tasking you with clearing several rooms with the tightest possible route and avoid combat at all cost. Failing to clear platforms will mostly result in the enemy catching you and lead to your ultimate demise. Your abilities are no tools of combat, but means of traversal, and misusing them will attract your predator. Not only that, but your get out of jail card almost completely removes your usual biggest ally to escape the clutches of the E.M.M.I. Mobility. Using Phantom Cloak nearly removes all chances of sneaking by an enemy, and should be used as a last resort, because doing any action in this mode drains your Aeon gauge like nothing. Sure, it's possible to get a decent bit further using the cloak, but because of the molasses speed, you most likely won't make it far and forces it on a recharge period that requires movement to recharge. They're platforming challenges through and through. And as a platforming fan myself, well, it's kinda basic. Don't get me wrong here, the later E.M.M.Is do require a decent bit of platforming skills, but not nearly as much as the combat encounters do. Even despite the cheating abilities later E.M.M.I have, like entire map scanning plus instant vision stun, it's rarely enough to stop you from getting to the destination needed. I think the level design here could have been more difficult without a shadow of a doubt. There are a few occasions where your movement does need to be a little more thoughtful, but nowhere near the amount of preparation some bosses require. On-the-fly decision making isn't that present, so reactive play is missing to me. which is why I think I have a preference towards this speedy bastard. Yellow E.M.M.I is the one that probably caught me the most off guard. I don't think it's the one I died to the most, but its speed makes for an effective chase of cat and mouse and gives me thrills that no others could match. Off-the-wall pathing could make the difference here, so I think I both hate it and love it the most out of all of them. And no, I don't count the first and last E.M.M.I as part of them. There's only 5 in my book. The best part of the E.M.M.I segments to me is the thrill of the chase. It's going to take several playthroughs to fully understand how the E.M.M.Is work properly. That is honestly fantastic. RNG spawns, route planning, your pants are all expected feature once you enter one of their zones. Of course, like any chase game, the fear factor does lessen over time. I can fully understand if a player wasn't affected much with the E.M.M.Is, and to me, it's partially due to 3 different factors. 1, defeating the E.M.M.I is painfully anticlimactic. I like the actual chase, but goddamn, ending the E.M.M.I is so unsatisfying. Number 2, dying is one of the least punishing actions in any Metroid game. Countering the E.M.M.I after they catch you is a hard action to perform, so you'll most likely die and restart at the beginning of the last E.M.M.I door you've entered, which lessens the danger and challenge the E.M.M.I is supposed to provide, and by proxy makes them less terrifying. And number 3, the general uses of background is mind-numbing in their consistency. While that's not particularly a bad thing, it does lessen the variety of regions and makes those areas seamy, which, yeah, I get that. It gets boring after a while. Here's the thing though, I understand the point of view of those criticisms. However, I could also understand and agree with the decisions made here. Tilting one way or the other with the E.M.M.I sections will most likely give a much different experience with them, and personally, I'm pleased by how they were done. Here's a big one, folks. There's a lot to cover here, so we'll take our time with this one, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Good. First and foremost, let's talk about the new stuff. Slide, spin boost, storm missiles, dash counters, flash shift, phantom cloaks, spider magnets are the new abilities found in Dread. While it seems like a small pool of additions, most new power-ups cover an important part of their gameplay uses. Exception here might be spin boost, but even then it serves its purposes during sequence breaks as a replacement for space jump. Most changes in Dread are mostly for utility purposes and diversity of play. It's something I'd advocate in any types of platformers, especially to avoid falling behind most modern interpretation of this format of games. Hollow Knight has a dash, Guacamelee has an attack dash, Dead Cells has a roll dash, Dust has a hair multi-directional dash, Hori has 3 different kinds of dashes, and now Dread has a multi-consecutive dashes. Phantom Cloak can help with interesting play behaviors in the E.M.M.I zone at the cost of mobility. Slide doesn't interfere with the morph ball while also increasing the general speed of platforming. Spin boost can be used to do some pretty tricky platforming, rendering space jump almost optional. Storm missiles can be casted and aimed while mid-air. You can do some pretty sick stuff with simple practice in this game. You can spider climb a wall and then same wall jumps, you can flash shift to the opposite wall, then wall jump to a higher ledge. You can chain spin boost by wall jumping, storing the charge, and flash shift to the correct location to unleash your shine spark. The diversity of movement options makes the general movement insane. Okay, quick tangent here. To quote Trevor, Ollie, the speed booster in Dread is pure sex. I cannot agree with this statement more. It's not only well presented, it's mechanically slightly more complex than past iterations since you can wall jump mid-speed boost then store and shine spark on a higher ledge, as well as keeping the speed going with a morph ball state, or even a slide. This leads to so many damn cool speed booster puzzles. They're not confusingly hard like Zero Missions or Dumb Bricks Easy. They're multi-room processes with solid variety approaches to them. You can easily look up 10 videos online around the same puzzle and easily find, I want to say, 2, 3, maybe 4 different strategies used to get specific items. That's awesome! And that's how future games should approach puzzles for items. Stopping mid-playthrough and figuring something like that out is great, because it places a figurative and literal mark on the player's head and map to tell them to come back once you have a better understanding of the ability's mechanics, or simply figuring out right now. Okay, back to the actual game mechanics. I've talked about the mobility of platforming. Now, let's talk about their combat uses. Again, I think the shining example of good platforming action games needs some sort of dash maneuver. Flash shift shines
here as a simple tactic to get out of harm's way, but lacks the DPS to make players more effective in combat. During flash shift, you are in a vulnerable state. You can't charge a storm missile, you can't screw attack, you are fixed to move a set distance. This can lead to move into bad spots or even fail. A good dash should be able to do two things in my mind. 1. It should allow the player to use the ability to quickly reposition to allow more hectic fights. And 2, it should allow the player to be punished for misusing the dash during combat. Large bosses in Dread covered those pretty well. Critters need work. Maybe by being beefier or tighter hallway design, I'm not really sure. What I am sure about is that bosses are effective at punishing bad users of flash shift. Ravenbeak will pound your ass if you misuse your dash, and Experiment will do residual damage if you are unaware of the set distance flash shift will cover. SQ has some great tracking on his abilities, so dashing away won't do you much good. Dread is aware how strong a tool like dashing is in platforming, and compensates it in its combat encounters by punishing poor understanding of it. Not to a brutal degree, mind you, but by a decent amount. Storm missiles have finally covered one of the biggest problems in Metroid, which was the missile factory. Storm missiles is an expensive ability to use. It can cost up to 15 missiles per full charge, but is reliable and steady damage. For a first-time player, you will rely on this ability by a fair bit, since it's good at what it's doing, which is forcing out a large amount of resources out of you, but will not give you optimal DPS. If you don't go looking for more missiles expansion, you will begin to dry up on these resources in the late game. Since storm missiles and regular super missiles share the same resource, you have to make a conscious decision on which ability you want to deal your main damage. Super missiles deal more DPS, but need good pattern recognition to hit, while storm missiles are reliable at the cost of losing DPS. That's a good thing! And I'm glad we're finally addressing this issue without giving us worthless tools like the Super Beam and Prime. I was anticipating the Phantom Cloak to be able to have its uses during overworld encounter with craters, and was disappointed on how one-sided this ability was. Same goes for Grapple Beam. Both of them are undervalued abilities in Dread and would have had a lot of potential in enhancing combat variety. To my surprise, Morph Ball and Slide get a decent bit of time in the spotlight, not only with stuff like the Kraid quick killing, but also as a dodging ability to later fights. And by far, the biggest contribution of Dread, for the better or worse, counters. I take back what I said. The entire games gets benefited just because of that one addition, instead of like 40% in combat. I don't think dashing into a counter is that good of an addition. It's too good, it's too powerful. I think being still would have been a greater risk and a better challenge at having good positioning for players than being allowed to step forward while dashing. It covers too many possible risks. There are, in my opinion, 0 instances in which countering while standing is a better defense than dash countering. Not only that, countering is too effective of a strategy to not attempt it during later fights. Corbius in the Experiment fight get bullied by countering their moves and pumping missiles into them. It's a more effective method to wait for Crater to give you an opportunity to get countered than aggressive play, cause you one-hit KO them every time! This can lead to less skilled player to rely on this move too much and prepare them less when actual combat is needed. Funny enough, this move is also forced on you later on. I was kinda shocked this wasn't implemented early in the game as a forceful mechanic to finish off larger targets. The fight with Ravenbeak legit took me a while to realize that countering his first phase is the only way to deal meaningful damage, and since I didn't want to take the risk of countering, I spent the first 10 minutes trying to figure out how to deal damage past this shield.
No, probably not.
Ow! This is a small complaint in the grand scheme of things, but it felt worth mentioning that despite the incredible uses of counter, it still took me some time to figure out something that's quite simple. In all honesty, I feel most conventional Metroid items are disappointing in uses. Again, while Morph Ball has some cool moments in boss arenas, How come we didn't get an E.M.M.I mobile chase segment? Ice missiles are criminally underused too. No cool platforming tech you can pull off with frozen enemies, and like I've mentioned previously, Grapple Beam is such an undervalued upgrade to what it could have been. All of these additional functionalities is a lot to ask out of a game that's, to be frank, already phenomenal and incorporating new additions, and you do risk at one point to oversaturate the game with tons of high-stakes scenarios using probably one-time upgrades, or how we like to call it, the Zelda syndrome.
What does that one even do?
And the more you move forward with the game, the more you expect the complexity to ramp up, and with 23 different abilities, yeah, things will begin to merge together, and assume with broth so opaque, it becomes liquid. So while I'm slightly saddened of what this could have been, I understand that many players would need to actually have the ability to play the game and not leave Dread to be only played by high-level players. There's casual folks out there, even kids, by the way. Oh! That's another thing too. Dread is approachable. There's nothing here that's outside the capabilities of someone who's willing to put, say, 30 minutes into learning the entire arsenal of Dread. Besides, there's plenty of occasions where Dread lets go of your hand to explore your abilities as you see fit. Even general critters have more going on with them, so testing abilities are even better, despite the counter. Yes, I do believe some upgrades could have used a rework to make them more interesting, but the balance of weaponry is overall very well done. Can we take just a couple of minutes to appreciate how unbelievably great these controls are?
Sick.
I think this is the first time I felt like I played a completely seamless Metroid game. Accounting for the abrupt speed acceleration, deceleration, or the mood jumps in the 2D game makes them hard to jump back in. It took me less than an hour to adjust to a brand new control flow for Dread, and going back to the previous game felt very much archaic in contrast. Granted, the last time we had a game with a rigid control flow like that was over 15 years ago. Samus Return did a solid-ass job bridging the gap between GBA control scheme and a more modern approach to controlling Samus. I can't blame the old games for feeling old since the new one is so good. A lot of it reminds me of the Ori games when it comes to general movement. Of course, it's not a one-to-one, but the switching in and out of movement options is smooth like butter. Without having this low velocity and ramp-up speed, you get all the benefits of tight spaces combat, whilst also having the smoothness of chaining abilities. If we're talking just general Metroidvanias, quote-unquote, I don't have one in mind that achieves a similar level of controls. That's not a good thing. That is a great thing to have. Having controls that are adjustable and easily improvable to the smooth nature makes for an easy replayable campaign. Considering the reception of Dread in general and the explosions of speedruns out there, I think it's safe to assume its movement and ease of entry for most players is partially why it's been such a successful game. The word to focus here was partially, by the way. I'll circle back to this point later on. The general reception I've heard of Dread is that nothing really interferes with general movement. It's been talked about to death online at this point, but for the sake of the argument, flow state describes a state in which the player's skill matches the challenges the game provides, and how I like to call it, mechanical immersion. This to me just means that the controller disappears, and I just play the game without thinking about which action I'm thinking of and removes the critical part of my brain that accounts for input delay, dead zones, and the likes. Now, everything I just said is great, but only applies to whether or not you can adapt to the controller setup. Because for some f***ing reason, button and action remapping isn't an available option in Metroid Dread. Yeah, it's crazy to me that action remapping is not a feature for any game in 2021. Of course, things like dead zones, I understand why you wouldn't implement them in a console where controllers are pretty much set. Yeah, this. But action remapping? Like, come on, man. Whilst I myself have no issues with the button setup, to me, this is inexcusable. Same with stuff like a colorblind mode,
Why isn't this a base option in every video game with a large budget? General accessibility shouldn't account for every possible scenarios, but guys, could you throw us a bone here? I'm not asking for controller setup for motor disability, just one of the simplest things you can add to your options menu. Something nearly all of your direct competitors have done, even ones with lesser budget. Like, what the f***?
Let me start this segment with this clip of me reacting to its announcements back in June.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
Wrong clip. Give me a sec.
But I personally really want to have difficulty back on the menu when it comes to a Nintendo game.
I'm glad the game was difficult enough. Why the asterisk? Because Metroid Dread isn't cheap. Just like the bosses segment where I pointed out the extremely well telegraphed attacks, every enemy is understandable with even just a small amount of time studying their attacks. It's effectively simple reactionary combat. It allows you to be aggressive and defensive at the same time. That is something difficult to multitask, and those first few encounters will kick your ass. But as soon as you do repeat playthroughs, the game becomes much easier. Not because the numbers are tuned differently, but because you can understand the attack patterns better. The hard mode of Dread proves my point very well. Nothing in a hard mode is that much harder outside of damage taken. I legitimately think the difficulty in Dread is extremely well done, and isn't pulling punches, which is pretty accurate to what the difficulty in Metroid games usually is. It's kinda nice seeing a AAA game from Nintendo that gives you a somewhat difficult first run. I understand this kind of difficulty isn't for everyone, and maybe the difficulty may turn off some new players. There will be occasions while playing you'll think you don't have enough resources. Even so, learning and understanding how to counter tactics is what makes the difference between an unfamiliar player and a competent one. With all of this said, Metroid's hard mode is very disappointing. If you'd wish to have a new way to play Metroid Dread, then this will do nothing for you. Hard mode is just higher damage taken, and that's it. No damage tuning, no new moves, no higher health pool, no replace craters to spice up future run, no anything. Again, this isn't something new for any games, especially where tuning these types of things is tougher in a search action game than, say, an RPG. Even so, I cannot hide my disappointment in including this feature. Hell, if you were gonna make it a little sweeter, why not make it the fusion mode of Dread with the new skin of Samus in her fusion suit? They've done it in Prime 1 and definitely something known within the community. Now, an interesting factor is that the combat in Dread is what is actually difficult. None of the platforming challenges in Dread is that hard. Surprisingly so, I say. If you were to boil down 2D Metroid into two distinct primary genres, I'd say it's both shooter and platformer. And while the shooting part is definitely hard, the platforming one, it could have used a little work, is all I want to say. And if you think it's because platforming is just a harder skill in general to develop than shooting, yeah, 100% agree with this. A Hollow Knight search action game, by the way, Path of Pain is pure platforming, and Path of Pain is, well, it's Path of Pain. Again, let me reaffirm this segment. The actual design difficulty for Dread is honestly great. It pulls no punches and demands that you learn its enemies well in order to conquer the campaign.
Let's not talk about the most controversial segment of this entire review. Not the game, this review. The areas and structure of the world. Okay, let's quickly go over all of the areas of Dread and their specifics. Artaria is for the most part very well done, I'd say. Getting to each zone of the area is relatively smooth navigating. The one exception to it comes near the end of the game, in which you need to backtrack to obtain the screw attack, and only having one way to get to this room is very inconvenient, especially for getting hidden items there, or even just to leave a strong impression of its remote corners in replete playthroughs. Kataris is the obligatory fire region of the map. It's packed with dense corridors and open spaces to have some nice movement diversity. The issue with Kataris becomes apparent in replete playthroughs where it takes so long to just get out of your first passage through it. I want to say it's easily 20 minutes of just going back and forth, and this can become disorienting. Dare I say, annoying? When the areas open up, it becomes a lot more fun, I think. Although, blocking this path with screw attack blocks right after the experiment fight in which you backtrack to get the screw attack always struck me as, let's call it odd. Trying to also do a sweep of Kataras before power bombs mean that the closest teleporter to the hidden zones of the map is blocked off, meaning you have to do a whole circle of the area before accessing those hidden areas. Still, it has plenty of large and memorable spaces to make it a simple map of it in your head. That one part's just kind of annoying. Dayron is next, and Dayron I have very little issue with. For one thing, I think this zone has a lot of simple objectives going on for it, and also surprisingly doesn't act as a gateway station between different areas, meaning it can serve more purposes than what I would think of it. Kinda similar to Talon Overworld, to be honest. The exception to this rule is connecting this area heavily with Barinia, the next zone over, but we'll get to that one in time. Simply getting to the transport location is the fatal flaw of Dayron, and this drop to the E.M.M.I zones will be your bane if you fall down this trap. Barinia, for the most part, is awesome without having to deal with all the water. Just like any Metroid game, the water here will break your mental in half. And although I did enjoy retrieving the gravity suit by diving deeper into the waters by doing some platforming and combat encounters there, shame I always take the gravity skip now since it's exponentially faster. Vertical level design is usually hard to pull off, and Barinia is quite solid in that aspect. Barinia might be one of the most dangerous regions to venture to. Makes sense, I guess, it's basically an underground bunker. This region focuses a lot of combat encounters through various revisits. It's for the most part easy to navigate since there's no really closed-off section of this area except for the E.M.M.I fight, which thankfully doesn't have any hidden items inside. It's a lot of fun clearing high levels of defense in Barinia, only to be overrun by the X seemingly more so than any other regions due to the more concentration of fauna near the surface of the planet. It's only missing a teleporter right around the right side of it to make it perfect in my book. Gavaran is the worst. As you can probably tell, if I have to circle an entire area to get to the zone I want to be in, then I dislike wasting my time circling the whole carousel. There are too many places in Gavaran that are either 1. Out of the way of a full clear, 2. Clearly section off parts of the region, and 3. Doesn't have easy ways to cover for isolated parts of the region. This missile tank is the worst! Holy shit! If you don't have power bombs, you will waste an exuberant amount of time getting this expansion, specifically because you don't have a good way around the map. Having even just a few secret screw attack blocks around here would have been a godsend miracle to alleviate some of the boredom of circling back the whole area, because nothing of interest is here. It's all tucked away on the right side of the map. Elon is there. It's atmospheric for one thing, but it's so tiny. If the area was expanded to compensate for more scenarios, I think I'd be happier. And this whole morph ball segment is just a waste of time to me. Yeah, sure, there's some hidden items there, but it's quite long for something so simple. Anubia does its job very well, but just like Elon needed to be expanded in my head to achieve the entirety of its potential. I am somewhat annoyed to 100% clear the regions. Although doing a general clear of most areas is fine overall, every area is tight and compact, so while you do have some pretty big rooms here, and every piece of platform are just tight enough to fit in the right amount of movement options, just large enough to make it possible to outmaneuver the critters, honestly, every region does feel very similar to a large Zelda dungeons. You do have times in which that pattern is broken, like these critters near Kraid's prison, where the room is just not large enough, you have to counter or take a hit, but overall, every room was thoroughly thought of. Whether you believe they work or not is up to each player. Personally, I'd sit around the range of a 90 to 10 split of room enjoyment. 90% of them I actually really like, and 10% of the rooms I cannot stand. Where Dread gets particularly weird is how the map is connected. So, folks like Game Maker's Toolkit have already covered one of the weirdest moves in Dread. You don't really get lost. Surprisingly so, I'd say. This opinion comes with an asterisk. A large one at that. I got lost on 2 separate occasions in my first playthrough. Right here after obtaining the spider magnet, and right here after entering Kataris for the first time.
You always gotta kiss your homies goodnight. It's not a gay thing, it's just a very gay thing. Wait, hold on. Where am I going? Okay, so we can't do anything there because we need Varia suit, absolutely. That can't be it. Oh my god. Of course. Of course. Of course.
Every other time I was searching where to go next, I wasn't confused. I was simply led to the point where I was supposed to be without making the choice to go there. 9 out of 10 times, the first door you didn't enter is the door that allows you to progress to the right location. Making an active choice to move somewhere in Dread is basically non-existent. Mercury's theme is unfortunately leading you by the head in Dread with more breadcrumbs on the ground. It's not something I'm particularly a fan of in Metroid. Hell, I'd even say that Fusion in more occasion asks you to make smarter map planning and movement with stuff like the security locks. Whilst you have large memorable rooms you can easily remember in Dread, knowing where they are on the actual map and how to travel there is very hard. I ended up looking at my map almost every room in order to remember which path to take. Something I did far less in the other games. I believe it's mostly due to the lack of repeated passage through several rooms in Dread. Outside of Katara's first visit, in which you have a good understanding of which room has the ability to move forward and which switch meant the previous door just unlock. The amount of times you have to revisit rooms is much smaller than some in Prime 1 or Super or Fusion even. Area 5 has been forever etched in my mind as to which room connects to which. Artaria, Burinya, Daron. I have to constantly check my map every few rooms in order to know where I'm supposed to path towards. Because I wasn't focused on my pathing in my first playthrough. And this kind of pathing happens constantly in Dread. For example, right after obtaining the Morph Ball, you are immediately tempted to go through these passages to test your new ability. Cool! Turns out, as soon as you drop down, you find this perfectly placed missile expansion blocked off by a perfectly placed Morph Ball sized tunnel. So, you of course go to pick it up, move a little bit forward, and find in a very short amount of time this teleporter that leads you directly to the next power-up, in which the game makes the decision for you to go left because of this other missile expansion through the Morph Ball hole, which makes you move left and find another tunnel with an additional item. Again, this is following breadcrumbs, and I'd rather have a system like Zero Mission telling me where to go without showing me the path than the game tempting me with a sweet, delicious, beautiful trail of Mentos. One is mysterious to me, the other one is just a bunch of distractions. This is all personal preference, of course, but even with more linear titles, they still left you with an unknown sense of discovery with each room, and not just stumble across goodies. Hell, the one time something like that did happen in Super, it's used as a f***ing trap. This overall map design is not a terrible idea. In fact, you could say the latter is kind of mean for new players, and the former is much more friendly towards said new players. If not for these breadcrumbs, nearly all upgrades are next to one another, so once again, getting lost is mostly optional in Dread. If not for this part.
Power slide. I don't think I can power slide midair. Maybe. Nah, I can't do it. Oh my god.
I'd say this is the easiest 2D game to navigate, if only because you do very little navigating. Getting off track to collect earlier items is honestly a pain, if only because you get so little out of it and you lose a lot of said time tracking back to earlier rooms, if played in the correct sequence. Metroid Dread, I think, will become famous because of one thing. Sequence breaking. Dread was built and designed around sequence breaking. It's by far the biggest design structure in the game. It's intended to sequence break on repeated playthroughs, and it's honestly kind of amazing how much you can bypass or simply ignore altogether. I mentioned before that I always go for the early gravity suit. And while I think it's one of the easiest skip to go for, the speedrunning community found so many possible sequence breaking that were fully intentional by the developers. It's kind of amazing, and again reminds me a lot of Zero Mission. It's hard to remember a Metroid game with sequence breaking being intended, and I think it's the first time we've had so many intended diverting routes. Like, of course there are glitches you can use to enter earlier areas and get early upgrades. But overall, it's hard to argue this diversity of route is bad for the longevity of the game. Even so, there are multiple ways other games have achieved similar ideas, and I'd argue done better as well. We have to mention Hollow Knight here. It's the king of finding your own path, with routes so diverse it's nearly impossible to count them all. Dread follows a very rigid first playthrough and only opens up with doing repeat playthrough. And whilst I think this is good enough, I look at other search action games like Hollow Knight and Ori Will of the Wisp, and I see that your first playthrough allows for more diverse choices and still allows sequence breaking. In my mind, there's no doubt that big budget games like Dread should try to achieve some sort of structure similar to those, or enhance it. In this context, Metroid Dread feels 5 years out of its competition. I need to remind everyone, Dread is extremely competent. I'd argue possibly the most competent at authorizing sequence breaking in a search action game. But choices of pathing are important, and being forced into a singular sequence breaks part of that flow for most players. I haven't crossed anyone who had the exact same pathing decisions as me in Hollow Knight, but every Dread player is gonna have the exact same first playthrough. Even so, I truly feel like you're only allowed to sequence break when the game wants. This last opinion isn't true, obviously. Tricks like shine syncing exist after all, but it feels like you're not allowed to break the game in a game that has tons of sequence breaking. I heavily recommend checking out Game Maker's Toolkit video on it if you liked a more thorough approach at Dread structure. Overall, the structure of the game isn't unbelievably disappointing. It's very solid. It's fundamentally solid. It's just not exceptional.
I would wager Metroid Dread is gonna dictate a lot about Metroid's future. The aesthetics, the structure of the 2D games, the art style, the core gameplay mechanics, and plenty of others. I'm willing to bet too that the series is gonna go the Sonic route of releasing games that are both traditional genre, 2D, and the modern genre, 3D. This isn't certain, but is a relatively safe bet. There are good things, even great things about Dread, but I'd be lying if I said that I felt that Dread isn't behind its competition. Metroid is no longer ahead of the curve. It's following it, or at the very best, stands at its side. Very similar to Sonic Mania from that perspective also. An extremely praisable game on its own, but wouldn't be the success it was if it wasn't from its predecessors. If Metroid is to keep the legendary status it holds in the industry, it needs to innovate. Soon. With the large new audience Dread has received, Prime 4 coming out most likely before the end of the Switch era, and most likely another large marketing push behind future games, everything is pointing to the direction of a bright future. But we as fans must ask for more. Not more games, more innovations. Most indie titles have since integrated plenty of better approaches to narrative, structure, variety of gameplay. You can argue me all you want, but if the Ori games didn't prioritize narrative and its structure, most would think of it as a pretty average game with amazing animations and fluidity of movement. If Hollow Knight didn't completely reinvent the structure of a search action game and didn't blend the bleak atmosphere of its world, its fanbase wouldn't be as nearly consumed by its approach to narrative, or wouldn't revisit it as much as it does. Prime 1 was successful because we've never seen an FPS platformer with item-based progression. Super was successful because it perfected the open-world item progression format. Metroid is now on a successful platform, and the chosen developers of the future, be it Mercury's team or Retro Studios, or any others, need to be aware to do more. If the next 2D game of Metroid is only a new map with a couple new upgrades and a new story, I'll be very disappointed. And if Prime 4 comes out with the same ideas as the original Prime trilogy, then in my mind, it's missing the mark of a potentially huge market of people. I don't think it will personally. Nintendo is famously stubborn at releasing games that only enrich new gameplay opportunities. It's the reason F-Zero, Star Fox, Chibi Robo have been dead for such a long time. Heck, Prime 4's development had to be restarted from scratch because Nintendo wasn't satisfied with it. It was given back to Retro Studios. That alone
gives me enough confidence to think Prime 4 will turn out fantastic with interesting twists. Cause that had to be the most savage move I've ever seen from a AAA developer. Granted, there are exceptions, but they are only that, exceptions. Don't settle for less, ask for more. I know this is asking a lot out of a community that's still hung up on missing Ridley and Dread. For some reason, don't rely on past glory and repeating products. Advance the design and world of the franchise. For my money, I'd love to see where the Galactic Federation's shadow operation leads and the consequences of the corrupt government. That was the intention behind the traitor plotline in Other M and the action taken on the BSL infusion. Or even explore the idea of Samus being turned into a living bomb, Superman All-Star-like with the powers of the Metroid inside of her. Dread isn't the end-all be-all of the story of Metroid. There are clear and obvious ways to develop its universe, the same way so many fictions have done in the past. Hell, that's exactly what the Prime Trilogy did. It told a completely different story in those games with Phazon. Remove the shackles of conformity and embrace revisiting old concepts with modern twist, and or exploring new ones altogether. That's what both Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey did, and look how both were critically acclaimed and popular with a new generation of player. We are on the verge of a new age for Metroid, and I can't wait to see what developers will come up with. Super Metroid will never be invalidated. Metroid Prime will never go away. So when I see games that repeat that concept, I get frustrated. I have to criticize it in my mind, since it's essentially repeating something that doesn't have to be the case, while you could be expanding on most concepts. Dread, I feel, is the first one that truly just rethread grounds, and I just want to see more. I understand this review had a ton of nitpicks attached to it. And, well, when you put a game under a microscope, you start to see a lot of imperfections hidden within. I need to tell all of you this. If this review sounded negative, it wasn't. It was an exercise for me to start to better understand my likes and dislikes in a game. I like Metroid Dread. Actually, I love Metroid Dread. This might be recency bias. Even so, I think I'll revisit this game a lot in the future. For all of the little flaws of Dread, I find that large elements matter more to me than the rest. The movement options in Dread are way more entertaining than having some smaller issues about repeating bosses. The overall visual fidelity is more important than missing the feeling of Dread through the majority of the game. Metroid Dread is mostly everything I wanted from it. It wasn't scared moving the story along. It's an extremely competent search action game. It has the most demanding and impressive combat of any Metroid game. It's the flat out best looking search action game, rivaling Will of the Wisp for me. Its polish is immaculate. The lore implications were complementary and not disruptive to the world of Metroid. I understand the love for Dread, and I understand the critical praise for Dread. I myself acted like a fanboy for like a month and a half because it reignited a passion I had for the franchise. By all accounts, Metroid Dread is a success and should be celebrated like one. Hell, it even was nominated for a Game of the Year award. I mean, it was never meant to win, but it was a nice thought from the committee. As a video game release in 2021, it's a high recommendation for me for both veterans and newcomers to the series. People, listen to Jesse. Show Nintendo where the money is. Ask for more by supporting the official release. Please, for the love of God, don't leave this franchise in the dust again. So, if we're gonna end this the right way, let's go back to this little list right here. Where would I place Metroid Dread? In all honesty, saying Dread is a better game than Prime Wonder Super is not right in my mind. There are too many instances where it doesn't enhance its formula enough to place it on a high level, or at least not by my standards. So, to me, it goes right here. I'm not gonna touch on why exactly it's below or above certain games, since we're gonna be here for another 2 hours if I were to do that. But this is my honest take on Dread. Feel free to disagree with me. Thank you so much for watching. It's been let's call it a ride. I don't think I'll be leaving this channel alone for a little bit. I want to do more. I want to see more. I want to play more. And I want to talk more. And I want to produce more. So, when it comes to this channel's future in 2022, we'll see where it leads us. Because if y'all don't know, 2022 is going to be the 10-year anniversary. To anybody else out there, take care of yourself. Really do. Like, actually take care of yourself. Stay in good health, both mental and physical. Take care of your close ones. And keep it positive. I really do appreciate everybody's coming over here and staying till the end for that final message. But, yeah. I don't have much to say outside of that. Hope y'all had a really lovely holidays. And we'll see you all, well, in 2022.